Welcome to Back to the Bible, and another life-transforming study from the Word of God with Bible teacher Bryan Clark. How can you live a life of faith in a corrupt world? That's one of the questions Bryan covers today in his study, and the answer will help strengthen your walk with God. Now here's Bryan Clark with today's message.
Now it came about that when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Now those first two verses in Genesis 6 are hotly debated as to what they actually mean. But I think what he's talking about are the sons of God, are those who acknowledge God as God, which would be the godly line of Seth. And the daughters of men are those who have raised up men to the level of gods. That's Genesis chapter 4. So the line of those who worship God as God and the line of those who worship man as God were distinct in Genesis 4 and 5, but we have a crisis in chapter 6, and that is the two lines are intermarrying. And they are coming together, and they are becoming one line. And that is creating some serious problem that God has to deal with. That has been the emphasis ever since Genesis 3, that you have the seed of the serpent, which is the ungodly, and you have the seed of the woman, which are the godly. The other thing you notice in this passage is that it's all about mankind. God is sorry that he made man, and God's judgment will be on mankind. Verse 3, then the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. When he talks about his spirit, you remember we talked from Genesis 2 that the word spirit is the same word as the word breath. And God breathed into Adam the breath of life. And man became a living being. And what God is saying is that they will not strive forever with that breath within them, that God's going to pull that breath back out. They are flesh and they will die. And God is hinting at a judgment that's coming in 120 years. Some people take the 120 years to mean that from this time forward, people would not live to be more than 120 years old. That's hard to support, though, because some of the patriarchs did live to be older than that. And so it seems more likely that he's saying, in 120 years, I'm going to, in a sense, pull my breath back out, and men will perish. And that's a warning of the upcoming flood. Verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Now, what is a Nephilim? Nephilim really just means giants, or more literally, it means fallen ones. And I think what he's talking about are those fallen ones, in other words, the ungodly, who are giants of men and women. When he's talking about giants, I don't think he's talking about physically. He's talking about those who have raised themselves to a level of tremendous influence, dynamic leaders, those who have set themselves up as gods, what we would see later in Egypt with the pharaohs. As a matter of fact, that is how they're described later in verse 4. He calls them mighty men, as of old, men of renown. Men of renown means men of a name. It means these were people who had made a name for themselves. These were people who had established themselves as gods. They were men of tremendous influence, and they were very powerful. They were, in a sense, giants of men. Now, we've had this wrestling match over the concept of name for several chapters here. We learned in the end of chapter 4 that it was the godly who called out upon the name of the Lord. And that means to acknowledge all that God is, all that he is about. It would include his promise of a seed that would provide salvation. That's what it means to call upon the name of the Lord. And then early in chapter 5, we were reminded that when God created us in his image, he named us dust. He named us man, which is a word that means dust, as a way of saying, never forget, you're dust, I'm God. If we can keep that straight, then he says everything will work out. But what keeps happening is man determines that he's not dust, but rather he's God himself. And they formulate their dust into positions of great power, into positions of great influence. You remember in chapter 4 when Cain was sent away from the presence of God because Cain had determined, I will be God. I will do things my way and nobody's going to tell me what to do. That he went off and he founded a city. And what did he name the city? He named the city Enoch after his first son as a way of saying, I will make a name for myself. I will found a city. It will be great. It's named after my son. And it's the same thing that Moses is talking about here. It's that drive within to be God himself and to make a name for himself. So there's been this wrestling match between whether or not we're going to understand that we are dust and he is God, or whether we are God and we will make a name for ourselves. And that's what's being said in verse 4, that these men had made a name for themselves. They were powerful, they were influential, and in a sense they had created tremendous momentum for people to go the way of Cain, for people to turn away from God and to be influenced by their thinking. That brings about verse 5. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Notice the words that are used there. It says that the wickedness was great, that every intent was only evil continually. There's a lot of redundancy there, which is a way of saying absolutely everything that these people were about was ungodly, was evil, was wicked. They were absolutely walking away from God with no thought, with no intent of ever looking back at God. You remember when God entered into the discussion in Genesis 4 with Cain, and God said to Cain, Cain, if you don't change right now, sin is crouching at the door like a wild animal, and it is going to pounce on you, and it is going to control you, and it's going to dominate you, and basically you will no longer even think of me, but you will be dominated by evil. That's really what he was saying. Well, this is simply the playing out of that. God is basically saying there's now basically everybody on the face of the earth is now like that, where they have become so influenced by these powerful leaders who have set themselves up as God that all of the momentum is going one way. So everybody that's born, everybody that lives, they just kind of get caught up in the momentum and they're all going down this path of destruction. And obviously God needs to respond to that. Verse 6, and the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. And the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. This is a beautiful picture of the heart of God. Often when we think of the flood of Noah, we see this imagery of God being an angry, wrathful God who's pouring out judgment on the earth, and we fail to see what God said about himself. And what God said about himself is that he was grieved, he was brokenhearted. He was sorry that he had made man. He was sorry that this is the way they had chosen. God made man in his image with a will to choose. But God's desire, all the way back to Genesis 2, was that people would experience the goodness of God. People would experience the grace of God, that they would walk in intimacy with him. These people have believed the lie of the serpent that they can be gods, they can do it their own way, and now every intent of every thought is evil, and God says, it breaks my heart. This is never what I wanted for people, but they have chosen the way of judgment. They have chosen the way of destruction. I don't know how many times I've heard people say to me, if God was really a loving God, he would never send anybody to hell. But what people need to read are these early chapters in Genesis and understand that God has made us with a will. And that will is the ability to choose. And God has said, what I've always wanted for you is goodness. When you sinned, I provided the promised seed that would allow you to go back to Genesis 2 and experience my goodness, to experience my salvation. God said, I've done everything possible, even to the extent of giving up my own son to make this possible, but you still have to choose. And for those who choose the way of death, God says, it breaks my heart. He said he grieved, he was sorry, but that is their choice, and they would experience God's judgment. Beautiful verses to help us understand the heart of God in the midst of this judgment.
This is Back to the Bible with Bryan Clark. We're glad you've joined us for another insightful study from God's Word. You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, visit backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Now more of our study with Bryan Clark.
These people had made their choice. Just like Cain, they had decided they would be God. They were completely dominated now by sin, and they were headed to destruction, and they would not listen. But what God was saying is that the influence on the earth was so strong toward evil that unless God steps in and stops it, how many thousands and even millions of people to follow would also experience that same judgment. So God, in His goodness, brought an end to that and started over with Noah and his family, that people might know God, that people might call out upon the name of the Lord, that they would not experience that judgment. So in a sense, even though it was judgment to those people, to every generation that would follow, including ours, it was God's goodness of saying, understand that this is the way of Cain, that this is the end of those who choose to be gods themselves. But even to stop the momentum and to start over with a godly line, and how many thousands of people followed after Noah and responded to God because of God's choice to step in verses 6 and 7. When I'm done reading verse 7, I found myself longing for a simple word, and that is the word but. Because I'm wanting some hope in the midst of this much darkness, and that's what we get in verse 8. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord, and I think to myself, thank God for Noah, because there's something good out of this. Verse 9, these are the records of the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his time. Noah walked with God. Even though the entire world, however many were on the world at that time, and nobody really knows, they were all bent on going the way of Cain and experiencing eternal destruction. And God says, it's breaking my heart. God did find one in the midst of all of that who was obedient. God knew of one that walked with God, and God said, I will provide salvation for this one, that he might be saved from my judgment to come. And it's a beautiful picture of God's grace. It's a beautiful picture of God's salvation. Can you imagine what it would be like to be Noah? Can you imagine what it would be like to be the only family on the face of the earth that walked with God? Man, you talk about peer pressure. I mean, imagine the youth group. It'd be you. Imagine the accountability groups and the Bible studies and the worship services. I mean, it's just you. And for 120 years, it was just Noah. That is a long time to remain faithful and obedient and to walk with God while the rest of the world thinks it's a joke that God's going to bring judgment. There was one family that acknowledged God as God and walked in obedience to God, and that was the family of Noah. Verse 10, and Noah became the father of 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. Then God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them, and behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. You shall make the ark with rooms, and shall cover it inside and out with pitch. And this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. And you shall make a window for the ark, and finish it to a cubit from the top, and set the door of the ark in the side of it. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. And behold, I, even I, am bringing the flood of water upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life. From under heaven, everything that is on earth shall perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, And you shall enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds after their kind, and of the animals after their kind, and every creeping thing of the ground after its kind. 2 of every kind shall come to you to keep them alive. And as for you, take for yourself some of all food which is edible, and gather it to yourself, and it shall be for food for you and for them. Thus Noah did, according to all that God had commanded him, so he did. Now there's a lot of details in here about the ark, and I'm not going to go into all that. I think the point of the passage, though, is not that. The point of the passage is Noah and Noah's obedience to God. One of the questions that arises in my mind is why a flood and why 120 years to build an ark? I mean, why couldn't God just say, Noah, I've provided an ark, here it is, it's parked out in the back lot, go ahead and load up. I mean, Noah spent 120 years of his life building this thing. Building an ark on dry land. They'd never seen a flood, they'd never seen rain like this. One of the reasons I think God had Noah build the ark was grace. Because for 120 years, there was a constant reminder that judgment is coming, lest there be one person among those people that would believe that. And so God, in his grace, rather than just ending it right there, said, I'm going to give him another 120 years. God, in a sense, going the extra mile of grace to say that one person might believe. Nobody did, but I'm still convinced there was room for one more on the ark if someone would have. The New Testament calls Noah a preacher of righteousness, and it's talking about the fact that for 120 years he built on the ark, and as the hecklers and everybody else came by and they said, hey, Noah, what's up with the big ark? And Noah tried to explain it to them. He became a preacher of righteousness, trying to tell them there is a judgment coming. And that was an opportunity for people to respond. But I also see the reason those details are laid out, and God did it that way. I mean, think of the animal thing. Why didn't God just start over? I mean, why not build him a speedboat and let him survive and then just start over with the animals afterward? I think all of this has to do with Noah's obedience. And the point that God was trying to make is Noah walked with God, and Noah was obedient to God, and that's what God wanted. That's what God has always wanted, is people that will call upon the name of the Lord and walk in obedience to him and just trust him by faith. So God says to Noah, Noah, by the way, I'm going to send this great flood and it's going to drown everybody except you, and here's the blueprints to the ark. Well, God, that seems kind of big, you know. How long will it take? Oh, about 120 years. Okay, and what are we going to do with the animals? By the way, I'd like 2 of every kind on the ark. I mean, Noah's got to be thinking, how are we supposed to do that, you know? Maybe the dog and a cow, but we won't even get the cat on board. All of that is God's way of saying, Noah, would you just trust me? I know it sounds impossible. And so Noah was obedient. If you look at verse 22, that is the point. This story concludes with a statement, thus Noah did. You could put a period there and say, okay, Noah was obedient. But he wants to make a little more of a point here. Thus Noah did according to all that God had commanded him. It's okay, Noah obeyed, God commanded, Noah obeyed. Okay, we get it, put the period there. Moses says, no, I'm not sure you got it yet, so I'm going to say it one more time. So he did. So the redundancy is to say Noah obeyed. By the way, in case you didn't get it, obeyed everything God told him to do, because Noah walked with God. Okay, yeah, we got that. By the way, Noah did it. And there's a final statement that just says that's the point. What God wanted was someone who would trust him, someone who would walk with him, someone who would obey him. And God says, even if you're the only one on the earth, I will provide for you a salvation. I will not pour out my judgment on you. As a matter of fact, I will use you to repopulate the earth, and we're going to start over again.
Now Bryan Clark joins us in the studio with Back to the Bible CEO Arnie Cole and author Kara Whitney.
So Bryan, we're only 6 chapters into the Bible, and God is already having to judge the world and start over. Explain again how you see this as a reflection of God's goodness.
Yeah, so lots of people in our culture would see the story of Noah and the flood and the judgment. Most people would dismiss it. Mm-hmm. But they often also are very critical of this angry, wrathful God. But the two lines, so the two paths basically merge. So now everybody is doing evil all the time. It was full of sin. I mean, there's people dying and getting wounded and every bad thing you can imagine. So it does raise the question, what would you like God to do?
Right.
If he does nothing, then they say, why would a good God allow evil to continue? It's like no matter what he does, people are going to criticize. But I think what happens in the text is the momentum is full speed away from God. And there's millions and millions and millions of people to come. And either God steps in, stops the momentum, and starts over, or how many people are going to get caught up in that current of evil and their lives will be destroyed. The one thing we know for sure in Genesis is horrible things are happening on earth.
Right.
So it does raise the question, what would you like God to do in that moment?
So could you explain that? Is it like, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed, I'm sorry I made them? It just is such a bold statement. I mean, it really makes you feel like you're a millimeter small. He's so disappointed.
Yeah, I think it, again, reflects, this isn't an angry, I'm going to squash all you people. It's the compassionate heart of God that he made people to experience paradise. That's what he wanted. And this is what we as people made in the image of God have turned the earth into. So it just saddens him. He's sorry that this is what's transpired. It's breaking his heart. It's much more a picture of God with a broken heart, that this is what we've done with his world.
And there's people who view this as very mean. He sent the flood, but they did also have 120 years to repent.
Well, and again, what would you like God to do? Stand by and watch the violence and the destruction, or at some point put a stop to it? To me, that reflects his goodness, to stop it and start over, or there's no hope. That's the point of the story. Basically, all hope is lost unless something changes. There is not a person around that would be that patient to put up with that kind of abuse for that length of time without doing something about it.
Well, just myself. I would smite people in traffic. That's what I would do. So it just shows you the character of God there.
I've often thought if I was God, and everyone's glad I'm not.
Thanks for taking time to be with us today. If you'd like to listen to this message again, please visit us at backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more of Bryan Clark's teaching, right here on Back to the Bible.